This is Mainely Unspoken. Today we have as guests Carolyn Chute, who is running for governor of Maine, and Professor Thomas Naylor, who wrote several books that we're going to be discussing today. Welcome.
Nice to be here.
Glad that you're here. Now, you wrote this. Now, you're from Vermont, right?
Well, originally from Mississippi, but I've lived in Vermont the last 8 years.
Last 8 years. Mississippi, you lost your southern accent there.
Been gone a few years.
Oh, okay. And Carolyn, you're southern too, right?
My father.
Your dad, okay. Now, you wrote this book called Downsizing the USA. Now, what do you mean by downsizing the USA?
Making the country and virtually all of its institutions a lot smaller. The underlying assumption of the book is that conservative politicians who say that our government is too big are right, but that's only a piece of the puzzle.
What else has to be gotten smaller then? Government?
The government is too big because the whole country is too big, and virtually every major institution, ranging from our states, our corporations, our universities, our public school system, our military, even our religious institutions.
They're all too big.
We're a country that is obsessed with size. We're like megalomaniacs. And downsizing the USA is essentially a broadside attack on size and a pitch for that we should consider downsizing the country and every institution and eventually break up the union.
Break up the union. Well, we're going to get that to in a moment. Now, Carolyn, you believe in community. I mean, that's your big premise for running for governor. So is this what you're essentially saying, is to develop community more and get away from state government, get away from federal government, and have your local government or even neighborhoods be the most important factor of the business world?
That's absolutely the idea. The whole rationale under downsizing is coming at it from a communitarian point of view. I mean, some people who want to secede are trying to save taxes and for their individual benefits, but we see that one of the big losses in the United States is this absence of a sense of connectedness, a sense of community among people, and that we have to get back to a kind of human scale before that will ever be possible.
So you want to succeed from the Union, in other words, not be part of the United States anymore, the state of Vermont.
Well, more specifically, I would like to see the possibility of maybe Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine teaming up. The way that I like to express it is to pose the following question. Namely, what do Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont have in common with, let's say, New York City, Washington, D.C.
Well, they're not big cities.
Miami, Chicago, Los Angeles. And
Beverly Hills.
Beverly Hills. And the answer is they have the same thing in common with those big cities that Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland have with Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, and Vancouver. And the answer is, namely, nothing. They have nothing in common.
So you want more rural communities bounding together away from the big cities.
The
values are different.
In my ideal, what I would really like to see is the 3 northern tier New England states, the 3 I spoke of.
Because there's no really big cities up here in New England.
No, there are no big cities in either northern New England or the 4 Atlantic republics, provinces of Canada. I would like to see the 4 provinces join the 3 states to create a tiny nation about the size of Denmark. And Denmark has only 5.5 million people.
Does Denmark have big cities?
Denmark has one big city. Copenhagen is a reasonably big city.
Be like New York or Boston?
Oh no, it's not in this
not that category.
Not anywhere near that. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people, not millions.
How would we exist financially if we did that? Now, you're a professor of economics from Duke University. You used to be, right?
Right.
So you know a lot about money.
Well, The answer is we might thrive. A lot of people think that small countries can't work, but it turns out that the countries like Iceland, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, which are actually smaller than the state of Vermont, which has only 600,000 people, are among the 10 richest countries in the world. Tiny Iceland, which has 260,000 people.
If you're not being bled dry by giant corporate subsidies, Noam Chomsky says that over half of our federal taxes go to corporate subsidies, these giant, like oil companies and all these different things, these creations. If we aren't being bled dry, in that sense, we have actually more wealth to ourselves. I'm not talking about helping, some people go, oh, you just want to help the poor people in Southern California or something. Well, Maine is the poorest state in the union, so that isn't the issue. The issue is not helping the rich, you know, and then you learn to be more independent. Of course you could. You would.
And self-sufficient.
You would.
Because you'd have the money to be self-sufficient because you're not giving the money away to the big corporations so they can become richer. It's kind of
Or the big government.
or the big government.
I mean,
Well,
we don't
it's the same
have
thing.
to.
It's all the same thing. The big government, the big corporations are one thing. That there's no.
I mean, take the Defense Department. Since September 11, it looks as though the defense budget in the United States is going to be moving up towards $400 billion a year, an all-time record.
So they're printing more money.
Why should the people of Vermont be investing in protecting big cities and big military installations when the likelihood of anyone ever attacking Vermont is pretty remote? I mean, what are they going to do with it? There are no military bases in Vermont. There are no strategic resources. I mean, there's one IBM plant. Would they burn all the sugar maples? Would they perhaps poison the black and white Holstein
wouldn't
cattle?
they throw anthrax around, though? I mean,
What would be the reason for it, though? If the United States government is imperialist and it's going around and bashing one country after another all over the world, and the country called the New Atlantic Republic is not, why would they want to come and terrorize this?
Because it's so small, it's a threat to no one. So if you look at countries like Switzerland and Sweden, for example, both of which are neutral countries, and are tiny. I mean, there are no terrorists after those countries. They're not involved in any kind of wars because they do their own thing.
okay, so what you're saying is that since Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire, we wouldn't be trespassing on foreign soils and causing trouble.
We wouldn't be trying to impose our will on the rest of the world. We wouldn't be trying to have McDonald's and Walmarts all over the world, or telling.
We wouldn't be bothering them, so they're not going to bother us.
Right.
And the United States, Washington, D.C., is bothering a lot of people in the world.
To put it mildly.
To put it mildly.
Yeah,
Okay.
Capitol Hill, Wall Street.
And as a result, we're being attacked because of the government.
And then we're surprised that we are being attacked. I mean, if you take a look at our foreign policy of globalization, I mean, since World War II, Afghanistan is the 22nd country that the United States has invaded. Wow. Few people know that, but since World War II, our one-sided, unconditional defense of the state of Israel and our obsession with Saddam Hussein, why is it surprising that some Arabs don't like us? I mean, when we sit back and say, how can this possibly be?
And as a result, everybody in the country now is being threatened because of that foreign policy.
Yes, yes.
My wish is that if we did such a thing, all the other states would say, hey, and they would do the same thing, and then Capitol Hill and the Pentagon and Wall Street and so forth would all be just sitting there by themselves, and everybody will have left. And of course, since they wouldn't have the feeding tubes into our states anymore, they would wither and quietly, peacefully just with her.
So getting back to the economics, so okay, let's say, well, first of all, can we leave? Can Maine, New Hampshire, and Maine just say, okay, Washington, we no longer want to be a part of the United States? Can we do that?
Constitutionally, there's no problem whatsoever. Politically, militarily, whether they would allow it, that's a quite different question.
I don't think they would
But
allow it.
see, the Constitution essentially doesn't touch the subject. There's a clause in the Constitution that essentially says anything that the Constitution says that you can't do, you are allowed to do. And the Constitution does not say that secession is a no-no.
So we can do it if we wanted to.
Legally, constitutionally, we can do that.
But politically, they wouldn't
Whether
allow
a
us.
nationalistic government would allow it, it would take some negotiation. It would take some time. But remember, if you were standing if we were sitting where we are in say 1985, how many people thought that the 6 so-called satellite nations of the Soviet Union in 1989 would free themselves, and it would be virtually nonviolent. Only Romania, of the six satellite countries of the Soviet Union, left violently. The others, it was nonviolent. They essentially brought down their communist governments.
Why would the United States of America let those 3 states go? What would be the benefit for them to let us go?
Well, they would first have to, I guess, stir up a bit of trouble. I mean, if they were putting a lot of pressure on it and making it very clear that they wanted freedom, and here's this country that advocates freedom and democracy, the United States, the United Nations, etc., and we're denying these republics, these states, the right of self-determination, there would be a lot of bad press, and so you could create a lot of...
They own the press. The big companies own the press, so they can easily use it.
Economically, I think particularly New Hampshire and Vermont, they might not worry so much about. Maine has got some military bases, some shipyards that they might
Like
be less
Bath Iron and
reluctant
Let it go.
to give up. It's not something they would voluntarily agree to, but the potential exists for these kinds of independence movements to become more active, particularly since September the 11th, in different parts of the United States. The most well-defined independence movements actually are in the 2 most recent states, Alaska and Hawaii.
Alaska wants to leave?
Well, I wouldn't say Alaska wants to
people
leave. About 25% of the people in Alaska.
Now, when did that happen?
It goes back. It goes back at least 25 years, and so they argue that it was never. It was quite illegal, the whole process that Alaska was brought into to statehood.
Hawaii was stolen.
The Hawaiian was blatant gunboat diplomacy in 1898. We just said Uncle Sam needs you when we kind of took Hawaii. But to say a little bit more about Alaska, the problem was in the election in 1958 or 59, the alleged election, the United States government allowed the military and military dependents to vote in that election without foregoing the right to vote back in their home states in the United States, or foregoing the overseas allowance that the military was receiving. And you can't have it both ways. And so what was the likelihood of military dependents voting against statehood when it was very clear Uncle Sam wants Alaska for the Cold War? And so that was the case. And of course, Native Americans were not allowed to vote because they couldn't read. So a significant number of
Native Americans weren't allowed to vote?
The
because they
Native
couldn't read.
Alaskans, you mean, the Inuits?
Because they couldn't read?
Right, they couldn't read. So
I mean, you have
were,
to know how to read in order to vote?
at that time.
Up until, that was true up until 1960s.
The 60s, yeah,
something.
right,
I didn't know that.
I remember we always had to read the
With the Civil Rights Act
Declaration.
aimed at the South, but
So
it affects...
basically what you're saying, the Alaska people didn't get to make
No,
that
they
decision.
had almost no input into it. It was really controlled
Talk
by...
about imperialistic. Yeah, that's terrible.
It was all a little sneaky. I mean, as if, you know, not like a big war. Everyone goes, wow, look at this, they're taking them over. It was sneaky, so people could say it was peaceful.
And then you've got the natives, Hawaiians, who are one of the most repressed minorities in the United States today. I mean, they never acknowledged that they were acquired by the United States over 100 years ago.
So is there a big political activist team trying to get Alaska out of the United States right now?
There's actually
25% is a lot.
there's something called the Alaskan Independence Party, who actually elected the governor in, I think it was 1992, a former cabinet member under Nixon, Hickel, was actually elected running under the Alaskan independence ticket, even though he was himself not a secessionist. It gave enormous credibility to the movement. But the party's been around about 20 years, and it consistently gets about 20–25% of the vote.
Now, how does a former Duke University professor of economics get into the subject of succession?
Well, that's a good question. It kind of evolved over time. In the late 70s and in the 80s, I used to consult with large corporations and had a chance to observe the amount of power that many of these companies have, and some of the consequences. In the 80s, I spent a lot of time in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and observed the demise of the Soviet Union. And my take on what happened to the Soviet Union, sure, communism was a corrupt and evil system, particularly the Stalinist model that the Soviets embraced, but that ultimately the Soviet Union collapsed because it was fundamentally unmanageable. It was too big. There was no way you could manage 285 million people from one central bureau in Moscow, and so it imploded. I don't think it's possible to manage 280 million people from one central bureau, or two.
Or take care of them well, and with,
Which is back to community and Carolyn's idea.
When we say the government's too big, in a way, it's too small. You had said this in one of your pieces, or your book, I think it was a piece that you had written, about how initially the United States government, when it was set up, the population was so much smaller, and the number of representatives and the number of senators that we have to go to D.C. is the same now.
That's
but the population's huge.
They can't possibly represent all those.
Right.
So actually, it's too tiny.
That's the point.
And too inaccessible. If we had some way to, even if we had some way to have it split up so that our government, we had another government, I mean, even this, I mean, I know it's not secession, but it's, if we had capitals in each state that were federal, that we could go and visit and park there and go in without having to go to D.C. It's a long drive. You have to go through New York, and it's a long, long drive. And imagine Californians being able to.
Hawaiians.
Hawaiians! Oh, good, yes. It's terrible. So in some ways it's too little, in some ways it's too big. It's too big when we talk about all the money. I mean, if they're way out there, we can't get to them, and they just soak all this money up, and these agencies are huge. They're out of control. DHS.
And very impersonal.
That's state even.
And you can't watch them. You can't watch what they're doing because they're so far away. So they're hurting you, and they don't even know if they're really hurting.
Not to say the state ones are so pure either. I mean, this corporate representation swarming the halls, and people are not there. People from the time they're in school do not learn to be citizens.
And then there's the whole question of campaign financing. I mean, essentially, elections in this country are bought and sold to the highest bidder. And so you've got this kind of insidious relationship between a monolithic, huge U.S. government and corporate America, who through their financing of the campaigns, pull the strings of the congressmen, who in turn make the laws that run the big government.
So do you essentially want to succeed from the union so you can have more control over your life?
That's precisely the point, to have more control over your own destiny, to walk away from some of the perks, some of the benefits. And if that's the case, if the United States is not going to take care of poor people in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont,
We're taking care of the people we're bombing, though.
the people would have to take care of
We
them.
bomb them and we'll send them money, right?
Yeah, so they will be dependent on
amazing
the United
hypocrisy.
States. That's what happened with Vietnam. Then the IMF, all these guys, all Russian, you know, and now you're dependent on us, so do as we say, you know. That's the only reason. They don't do it out of niceness. If it was niceness, they'd be helping out people they destroy here.
Yeah, really. And they're destroying a lot of
economically
people.
destroy us.
Absolutely.
Make us so helpless and dependent on the system. You go to school, what do you learn? Diddle a pencil, whether you're good at pencil or not. And then when you get out of school, you don't know how to grow a vegetable. You don't know how to take care of yourself.
You don't know how to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
That's right. So you want to succeed so you can have more control over your life, or everyone can have more control over life, so the government will soak the money that you manage to make so you can have a better life. And that the money that you do have, it stays in the community. It doesn't go back to Washington to be trickled down back to us. Get rid of the middleman. That's all correct, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what about our Constitution? A lot of people, I'm patriotic. We have a wonderful nation. We have the best government in the world. Do you not like the Constitution of the United States?
Well, I think the Constitution has served us well, but it was never, I think, envisaged that we would have such a humongous country, and that it's not the fault of the Constitution. It's simply that the nation itself is unmanageable from one government or one constitution. I mean, the same idea, as you recall, in the early 90s, many American companies were into downsizing. There was a realization there comes a point where a company becomes too big, and that bigger doesn't mean better. The bigger you get, the less efficient you become. I mean, the whole movement towards huge mega corporations, a lot of that is driven by the egos of the chief executive officers of the individual companies. Because we're already seeing many of those companies that the mergers of the late 90s are coming unglued at the seams, that they're not the panaceas. And so the point is, just as big corporations become too big, so too is the case with governments. And if you look at the history of the empires, and particularly in the last 500 years, Paul Kennedy, a historian down at Yale, wrote a book about this 10 or 15 years ago. And he pointed out that what happens to them is they're not brought down. Empires are not brought down by external forces, by losing a war to the Russians or the Chinese. They collapse from within because they become overextended. They try to be all things to all people. They're involved in too many military fronts. And I'm absolutely convinced that September the 11th, the year 2001, literally was the beginning of the end of the empire, of our empire, because the strategy that the Bush administration is taking is, I mean, we're going first to Afghanistan this very day. They're
So
now
obvious.
Troops are going in. They've got their eye on Iraq, Iran, Malaysia, the Philippines. Who will be next? And so as many of these wars as possible. And you know, the draft was abolished, around 1973 or 1974. It doesn't take much imagination to realize how many more of these little skirmishes and wars will it take before there are not enough volunteers, and you have to reinstate the military draft. And then I would say
They can draft girls now,
to the people of Maine, you know, how many people in Maine are prepared to die to make the world safe for McDonald's, Walmart, gas-guzzling SUVs, the internet, Bill Gates, and the Forbes 400 richest people in the United States.
That's a good point, but I don't think people view it that way. You know, you're absolutely right. When we go to war for the corporations. But people are thinking, I think people are thinking, we go to war to protect
That's what they
our
think.
land. That's
Yeah.
what they think.
Or
That's what
or
they're
a bit of
told.
revenge also.
And revenge, but this is why they're pumped up by the media, the mainstream media, pumps on this. It doesn't give them any time or moment to even, or any information to think any other way. There's no information. In fact, the more people listened to mainstream media about the wars in Iraq, the continuing war in Iraq that came up in under different administrations, the less they knew. Because they were watching something that only shows a flag flapping and a building
Those
blowing
flags
whatever.
made in China, too.
Made in China. All these sort of images that plop into the average American, like the average American is some kind of toilet. I mean, sorry, but that is what the American people are doing. They're just like receiving these images and not having any time or information or to think.
So it's important for people to start thinking and saying, well, if we go to war, I'm sending my young teenagers, 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, and they are kids.
And there may be women too, as Carolyn says,
And
this time
women,
around.
not just our sons, but our daughters, across to these soils or lands for them to make who wealthy? Or to protect who?
McDonald's, oil companies.
McDonald's, the
corn
oil
syrup
companies.
people,
Right.
sugar,
And that has to be
coffee.
repeated
Yeah,
over
and
and over
drugs.
and over
This
again.
drug thing is big. The big corrupt drug.
So what do
thing
we
that's
do?
going-
What do we do to keep our kids home so we don't go to war, so they are safe, and we start protecting who we should protect, ourselves, our economy, our communities?
Well, accepting that would be the very first step. I mean,
Accepting it.
That is a very big step that most people haven't
The
taken.
government's not going to accept
And they're
that.
not going to tell. They're not going to tell you that either. They're going to
Which actually leads to the subject of my most recent book, Affluenza.
Okay, so you wrote a book called Affluenza.
That we are so hooked on more and more stuff. We've got to have our McDonald's, our Walmarts. I mean, indeed, one can link the terrorist activities of the last month very directly to affluenza. I mean, that we are so hooked on oil in particular. I mean, the United States, even though we
Well,
represent...
Bush is hooked on oil,
Yeah,
right?
But Bush is not alone. The whole country is hooked on oil, even though we
I have a
only...
wood stove. I would have solar if I had an investment to make. I'd definitely go to solar, but yeah, most people.
Even though we only
most
account
people-
for 5% of the population of the world, we use 25% of the oil we produce, a third of the stuff of the gross product of the world that comes from our country.
So when the Atlantic Providences, this Denmark-sized
The
country,
new Atlantic
the new
Republic.
Atlantic
And we're going to run our
Republic.
cars on donut oil.
On donut oil?
Donuts. We're going to eat donuts, and we're going to run our vehicles on donut oil.
What is donut oil?
Well, there's a guy in our group, we are a political group, who runs his van on veggie oil, and he has a set of filters in there, and he runs it on veggie oil. It can be run on hemp, too. They outlawed hemp back in, I think it was the 30s, because the textile companies and the fuel companies and the paper companies were going to be losing some money to the new process that they had that was going to make hemp, or the industrial hemp, that is not marijuana, it's industrial hemp, was going to make it be a little bit of competition for them. And so they tried to confuse people and make them think that it was marijuana and hemp were the same thing, and that people, when they smoked marijuana, would jump out windows and act like it, instead of like quiet and sort of like that, they would act like nutty, right? And they would jump out windows, and that was to stop people from ever thinking of using hemp fuel, which is clean, by the way, one of the cleanest that there are. And we become hooked on this oil thing, which is a grit. Now, the most dangerous thing about oil, other than it's stinky and all that, some people go, it's not dirty, it doesn't do this, that's fake and all that. Well, aside from that, the obvious thing is, it's a grid, and it's got control of our lives. It's a big, huge grid. It controls us. It blackmails us. It says, send your kids to war, or you're all going to freeze to death, and you're all
Yeah,
going
60% of our oil is imported, and this is a key factor in the whole Middle East as to why we're there. We've got to have a military presence to to maintain our interest in Middle East
But there
oil.
are alternative ways to get energy. We don't need the oil. We do have solar.
The grid guys need it,
The
though.
grid guys. There are alternatives.
Yeah.
And would your new country, you know, invest in these new alternatives?
One would hope so.
One would hope so. So you wouldn't want to be dependent on oil.
Right, well, because among those 4 provinces and 3 states, there's, I guess, the only oil, indigenous oil would be, I think there's some oil off of Newfoundland, but they're not, these are not large oil producing territories, so they would need to try and limit their consumption of oil.
As long as though these companies own the media and have all these guys, you know, suits going into our state house as we are now, they could still sell you on anything, including laptops for all the kids so that they can get rid of teachers and all this stuff. I mean, as long as that is allowed, your democratic republic is still, there still has to be, besides, as I see it, besides secession, you've got to also be ready to prepare yourself for a real democratic republic, to have certain things in place, like not allowing corporations to have human rights.
Which is very difficult to do with the U.S. Constitution. See,
Contracts clause, commerce clause.
Vermont was the last state to succumb to Walmart. That we kept them out about 10 years.
How did you let Walmart in Vermont?
Oh,
How did that happen?
It was actually very clever the way they did it. They found some space, about 50,000 square feet, which is very small by Walmart standards, that was vacant. It was a former Woolworths in Bennington. And Walmart said, we'll just take that space. And so there was virtually impossible to keep them out of this Woolworths. But the ultimate weapon, see, that Walmart has to beat down any state is the U.S. Constitution, that they essentially hide under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, because it's ultimately almost impossible for a state like Vermont to just say, we don't want any part of Walmart. I mean, you never mind that you're going to destroy communities, eliminate all of the small businesses in the
Eliminate
villages.
competition. Isn't that called monopoly? So I don't understand why it doesn't come under the monopoly law.
But they actually, Walmart uses the U.S. Constitution to maintain their monopolistic power in places like Vermont. And related to what we were talking about earlier, see, there are now 4,000 Walmarts, and Walmart will soon be the largest corporation in the world. It's approaching $200 billion a year in sales, which is just mammoth.
But also, the investor rights agreements, like the FTAA and the WTO and the GATT, the GATT is the WTO. The MEI didn't get done yet. NAFTA, but the FTAA.
Trade agreements.
Right. Well, we call them investor rights agreements because they're the only ones that get the rights, because we definitely would not. And what they would do is they will make all these decisions about this. If you say this is going to hurt my community, this is hurting our jobs, or this is hurting our environment, or whatever it's doing, tough. They meet behind closed doors, and they decide, and they can sue your government and break it for denying them the chance to make all the money they want to make, whatever they want to do. It's really, you can't stand in their way, and that's what that FTAA would do. And they wanted to fast track it in Washington, and I'm wondering what's going on now, because you don't hear any more about that at all. I'm wondering what's going on if, while everybody's looking over to the east, the folks in Washington are very quickly getting a fast track.
Interesting.
A fast track, which was, what fast track was to get the FTAA signed by the president with a very minimal discussion in the House and Senate. There would be almost no discussion, just a few days. An enormous thing, you know, this big giant, you know. So these things too, as well as Commerce and Contracts Clause, affect our lives in very negative ways.
So it sounds like, Professor Naylor, that America is hopeless, that we have these big corporations, Walmart and the oil companies, and Washington, D.C. is far away, and there's no way of gaining control of our lives. I mean, we need more and more stuff.
Well, I think that America may be hopeless, but Americans, you know, the people are not hopeless. That we're still capable of thinking for ourselves, and what we've got to do is come up with ways to become free of these mega corporations and big government. I mean,
And is there any other way besides succeeding from the Union?
well, that's seceding from the Union is I think really just one piece of the puzzle. As we were speaking of affluenza and overconsumption, when we use the term affluenza as a kind of play on a medical metaphor, a virus, so to speak. It's the all-American bug, in which we're hooked on everything from fast foods, junk food, wine, beer, electronic devices, personal computers, to mega
Some people like
mansions.
that. They say, this is great. I love McDonald's. I love Walmart. I love my computers. I mean, a lot of people, they are addicted to it. But you're saying it's not good for them.
Well, the more we have, the more we want. It's not in moderation. None of these things may.
They don't pick and choose. They just got to go out shopping all the time and shopping and picking up more things, crinkly bags.
At one level, affluenza is nothing new. I mean, kings and queens and royalty and pharaohs for centuries were infected with affluenza. What's new is everybody's infected with affluenza.
And it's killing us. It's killing our society.
Well, it's ultimately it's a spiritual problem. It's killing our souls, so to speak.
And how we think. It's not allowing us to think anymore.
Right, right. It's our obsession.
It also ties into the people who don't have much money to get extra, who are pretty poor. They too have found that everything they need costs money. So that they're constantly having to come up with money, maybe work 5 jobs, you know, for very little pay, just to buy everything that years ago might have been free. Even taking care of their children, they can't even take care of their children anymore because they got to run out and earn money to pay the rent, which, you know what I mean, they got to have somebody else take care of them. Instead of taking care of your old folks, you got to, the old folks are in the nursing home, so they had to give up their home, their house, to pay for the nursing home. The old person did. So now the children can't inherit the place and move into it, so now they got to buy another house too. And the husband and wife are both working, so they got 2 cars, and you know, and all this. But they might be just really just still scraping by for basics. So even the people for basics are still tied in some way with the affluenza ones who are, you know what I mean? Everything is money.
And people aren't self-sufficient. They're dependent on this stuff.
And then what we do to the rest of the world, particularly the third world countries of the world, I mean the Bangladeshis, the Pakistans, the Chinas, the Guatemalas, is we say, look how great we are. You need to be like us. You too need to have more and more stuff. You need to contract affluenza. And we will help you get hooked on affluenza, and not only that, come to work in our sweatshops. And you may have a fraction of the amount of money to play in our game. And so we then gain control of one country after the other.
It strips people of their pride.
And they become, they not only lose their sense of community, they lose their independence because they're taken in, they're seduced.
And they don't think they're powerful because they think, I'm only powerful if I can buy what you think I should be buying.
Right, and so they're rendered impotent.
The island of Samoa, which is an American possession, there's stuff being made right now that, by it being made there, they can call it American made, but there are these Vietnamese and other people too from other countries, but Vietnamese people brought in, and they're in the prison-like situation. They are beaten if they try to take time off. They can't go to the bathroom. They can't do any of these things. They're paid very tiny. They cheat them out of stuff. They're slaves. There's no question about it. I mean, they're mistreated slaves, because I think we're slaves too. I believe we're slaves on the job because you don't have your constitutional rights don't exist when you're on the job because of the contracts clause.
Oh, really?
That's right. On the job, you have no. But we're we're kind of like house slaves. Many of us have had a little bit. We got to keep the buffer between the real revolt types and the keep us a little bit nice. But those guys are treated like real slaves. They're really, and it's American made. It's called American made. It's one more thing because I know what stuff he's saying is real important. But I just wanted to say is that I heard on the news in 1985 or 6. I'm not good at remembering numbers, but was that more than half of our food now, at that time, we do not grow ourselves somewhere else.
Well, we're going to lose all our agriculture soon if
we don't even have it. We don't have agriculture because agriculture meant family farm. It meant a culture around agriculture. All we have is agribusiness, giant corporations growing food, 1 or 2 big giant corporations, and they're tied in with the chemical companies so that they are. Well, anyway,
and we're losing all our farming land to South America anyways. Are they supposed to be opening up farming corporations in Brazil or something? So all our economy will go down there and we'll have nothing up here.
No work,
the United
no
States
food.
won't be producing anything.
Totally dependent on
We'll just manipulate the stock market.
We'll manipulate the stock market. So tell me, Professor, what about when the Union first started? We were sort of like the Republic of Maine, although not right away, but the Republic of Tennessee. And we were kind of like independent states with our own cultures, our own needs, and we were very loosely connected with the government. Could we possibly go back to that time?
Well, ideally, the answer is yes, but the problem is there are very few examples of still being under the same umbrella and going back to more independence. I mean, historically, I think where the break takes place is in the Civil War. That in many people's eyes, Lincoln was a hero, that he gets credit for freeing the slaves. But Lincoln was first and foremost a nationalist and an empire builder, and only decided to free the slaves as a kind of public relations act to rally support of the nation behind the Union, so to speak.
I think he knew he could break the South so that he could usher in industrialism. He could break the South by taking away their free help so that you could have the wage slaves come in.
So then you go, I mean, Lincoln is the first real empire builder. Then you've got the period of the Spanish-American War. Then with each of our wars, well, particularly World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression, the government will either give it or it takes more and more power from the individual states, always in the name of freedom and democracy. I mean, we use we were in such dire straits in the Depression that it was said that we needed a lot of central government programs, spending
they
programs.
did a lot of strange things during the Depression,
to bail us out, so to speak. And we're getting, I mean, some of the things Bush is proposing now make the Depression era Roosevelt look like kid stuff. I mean, the bailout programs that are under consideration right now. Then World War II, and then for 45, 50 years we fight a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and that was a justification for all kinds of centralization and government spending. So it's very difficult, I think, to turn that around, and I have no illusion that a republic, New Atlantic Republic, or any state splitting is going to be a pushover. I mean, if a state, if there were a significant number of people in Maine or New Hampshire or Vermont who wanted to do that, I mean, I couldn't conceive of that happening for another 10 years. But I don't think it's impossible. And I would go back to the example of, who would have thought in the early 90s that the Soviet Union would cease to exist, that it would literally implode and it would be completely nonviolent.
Now, you think September 11th is the beginning of that. It's the beginning of the United States empire basically dissolving.
Yeah. The end game starts on September 11th.
Okay. So, but how do you see it happening? How do you see it dissolving?
More of what Bush is doing now, a combination of military action on a wide variety of different fronts. First Afghanistan, then spread to Iraq, Iran, maybe Malaysia,
Syria,
Philippines.
I heard Syria.
Kind of in anyone who's not playing by the rules. So military action on a broad number of different fronts. Increased surveillance, anti-terrorist programs and activities of all sorts. All the while, the previous government deficits would seem mild compared to where we're headed.
So financially, it's going to collapse.
Well, that'll be part of it. I mean, it will be back right into the inflation that we had in the 1980s. The early 1980s.
What makes you think that the United States will be taken over by another country, though?
I don't think that the United States will be taken over by another country. I think that, remember we talked earlier that in the last 500 years, all of the big empires have collapsed from within.
From within.
None of them have been, I mean, the British Empire, the French empires, they ultimately, like the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire, imploded from within. So they try to be all things to all people, too many military fronts, the terrorism thing going, a tremendous surge towards centralization, not decentralization.
So even though most people might think, oh, succession, this is really way out, you're thinking, correct me if I'm wrong, that this is the natural process, that we are going to get to a point where the central government can't take care of us, we're going to dissolve, and new countries are going to be formed.
Right.
And people should start thinking about that.
Yes.
It even chooses to do
It's a natural progression.
less representation of the people, less services, so to speak, less for us, more for itself. It just begins to eat itself up and leave us in the dust. So, I mean, we aren't going to lose much.
At a minimum, the people of Maine should be starting to think about is one of the options, what if the United States collapses or does its thing in, does itself in, then what does Maine want to be doing? What does the state of Maine want to be when it grows up? And the same question for New Hampshire and Vermont. And then, okay, maybe Maine wants to go it alone. And Maine, if Maine wants to go it alone, it could. I mean, the scenario I laid out of collaborating with the other two states in the four Atlantic republics is simply one possibility.
Are there people in Canada thinking the same way in Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island?
I would have to say, in all honesty, I'm not aware of an active movement there. When I put up a trial balloon a couple of years ago, I must say that it attracted more media attention than anything that I had written in 15 years.
Now, when you say a trial balloon, what do you mean?
Well, I wrote an article advocating what we've been talking about, the new Atlantic Republic, and it was published all over those Atlantic republics. It was published in Charlottetown and in St. John, Nebraska. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation did 2 stories on it. I mean, most of the action on secession in Canada is, of course, Quebec, that's been going on for 25 years and is at the moment seeming somewhat diminished. If Quebec were to split, then I think that the temptation for the Atlantic republics to do so would be much greater, because they'd be left out there, if you look at the map, dangling by themselves. Quebec is an independent country, separating them from the rest of Canada. But there are other secession movements. So Quebec is the big one in Canada. Probably the second biggest would be out in Alberta, which is one of the richest provinces because of the oil and natural gas. And so that's kind of a Wild West type of mentality. And So they've got their own agenda of why they would like to split. They don't want to pay taxes. This is more of an individualistic.
Just like the New Hampshire town,
Yeah.
was it the one-
Over taxes.
it was their own,
We want to save taxes, and it's my own individual
We don't like
thing,
those guys.
not the community approach that we talked before. And then you get all the way out to Vancouver and British Columbia. There you find a movement of people, they call it Cascadia, who want to combine with Washington and Oregon and British Columbia to create a new nation. I mean, those three have a lot going in it. Maybe they'd link up with Alaska, maybe not.
So it's quite possible, because of where the United States is going, in 10, 15, 20 years, we could be many different nations.
It's possible, but there's enough unrest in a number of different places. And of course you've got the southeastern part of the United States that there's some people still fighting the Civil War. I never acknowledged that it was over, but there are groups down there that are really working quite hard in the direction of.
Well, I know Texas wants to leave.
And that's a special case. I have trouble getting a handle on Texas. There are at least 3 different groups who call themselves the Republic of Texas, and I'm not even sure which is the most relevant one. They kind of fight amongst themselves.
Well, let's get back to Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and the Providences. What do you see that country looking like? You talk about it would be about the size of Denmark, and how would we become rich? Because Iceland is very rich, is it not? Is it Iceland?
It's in the top 10.
How would we economically thrive?
Well, for starters, we wouldn't change what we're doing. I mean, we're not going to be the richest country in the world, for sure. I mean, if you look at the economic base of those 7 entities today, these are neither the 3 richest states. They're not the poorest either, nor are those. And in fact, those, I guess, the Atlantic provinces are among the poorer Canadian provinces, actually. I mean, they would continue doing what they do. I mean, New Hampshire has some technology. Maine has a relatively diverse economy. I mean, it's some high tech, some agriculture, some lobsters, some fishing, paper, wood products, kinds of things. For starters, just keep doing what you're doing.
Credit card company.
Yeah, we have MBNA. We want to get rid of them, though, right?
I think a lot of people live up there too. They seem to be kind of like taking.
Is Dartmouth too large of a university?
I would say Dartmouth is not too large of a university. It's the ones, to me, that, I mean, when a university gets over about 10,000, it's starting to get too big. I mean, Ohio State is 50,000.
Oh my goodness.
And there are a lot of universities, like Michigan,
Michigan
State, places like that are 30 to 40,000. Arizona State are mega universities. I think 10 is kind of like an upper limit, but for really my ideal would be like a college of 2,000 to 2,500, I think.
Because?
Again, small is beautiful, more sense of community, sense of connectedness.
University of Fort Kent, University of Maine at Fort Kent's perfect. There's about 200 students and lots of parking. I would like to say one tiny thing is that I don't have any illusions about the old days, the country under the Constitution right from the beginning. I don't have any illusions about that, and I don't have any illusions about, say, setting up a little country like this. It sounds homey and nice. I mean, human beings just don't know how to act. I mean, we're just really hairless monkeys. I mean, we don't seem to really, we just ruin everything we do. So, I mean, I don't expect them to do this wouldn't be paradise exactly. Of course, it's going to have its problems. And I will also point out that not everyone's even as nice as the 3 of us. And there's some mean stuff going on out there, and there's mean people in this area that we speak of who will be living here, and I mean really mean, and you know, things couldn't be perfect, but if this doesn't happen, I'm worried about, like he said, Americans, you know, we have a lot of mental resources, you know, we're nothing wrong with us to think up new things, and we're strong people, but America, the government, has got some problems, big problems, deadly problems. We're in real bad trouble, and it is probably going to collapse. And as Mark Twain said, loyal to my country all the time, and to the government when it deserves it. Unfortunately, when I think of country, I think of the people, and I think that, you know, we are going to start thinking up some radical ideas to be ready for when all this.
Now, when you say radical ideas, what does that mean?
A big change, big radical meaning, like Thomas Jefferson was the most dangerous radical in the world, they said, because he had ideas for change that were, you know, big changes from what was going on.
So for this New Atlantic Republic, I would see countries like Sweden, Switzerland, Denmark as kind of role models. And while economically, clearly, it's not going to be the richest republic, the richest country in the world. It's not going to be bad. But it would be a country already, you know, among the separate entities that has less traffic, less pollution, less stress, in general, a higher quality of life, even though the income level is not that of New York City, for example. One interesting side note relative to its attractiveness of the New Atlantic Republic, already, even though it's only a month since the September 11th disaster in New York City, there are an increasing number of families moving to the village of Charlotte, Vermont, where I live, for one and only one reason: to escape life in the big city. I mean, they were so traumatized by that. My son's school already has one new member, and real estate agents apparently are just making out like bandits, selling houses to people to former New Yorkers. And so it can be looked at as a problem or an opportunity. There are going to be a lot more people attracted to these three states because of what
Well, then
happened.
we'll become like New York, though. Then there'll be too many people, maybe. I mean, why did you move to Vermont? Because it was so rural?
Mostly because I wanted to live in Vermont. That I had a notion that if one was going to live in the United States, it was probably the next best thing to life in Switzerland. And you know, to a small and beautiful sense of connectedness that I mean, Vermont is basically a state of small towns, small villages, small schools, small businesses. It's one of the most democratic states in the Union, with our town meetings. And there really is a sense of connectedness, a sense of community. That's what I was looking for. We had very high expectations, and we have not been disappointed.
What didn't I ask you that I should have asked you?
You've done pretty well. We've covered a lot of ground. I mean, in a sense, the punchline of the New Atlantic Republic and some of the downsizing the USA that we've been talking about is we may be coming up on the point where we have very few degrees of freedom or few options. I mean, I don't want to over-dramatize it, but it may be that the only strategy that really makes sense in light of September 11, if we want to be free, independent of the fear of being taken hostage by terrorists, is disunite, not unite, disunite, pay the price, disunite or die. And then I think that it's time to review the bidding, that there's no reason why we have to remain a monolithic, huge nation. There are options on the table, and we ought to look at them.
Carolyn, we only have about 45 seconds left. What would you like to say? Last thing you want them to remember.
Well, I think it's probably all been said. I do know that it is nerve-wracking to think of the the rights that can be taken away from us in the name of national security, when all along it was really not national security, but the security of this big power. And I've heard before that the number one enemy of the big power is the American people themselves, especially if they wake up and want to preserve their rights and all that.
Professor, any last words? 15 seconds.
As Pogo said, we have met the enemy, and it is us.
Okay.
I love Pogo.
Carolyn, thank you. It's been a pleasure as usual, and thank you for coming too.
Being with you. Thanks for having us.
Well, you're welcome. You want to get these books. One is called Affluenza. This will tell you why you need to start thinking about what's going to be happening to the future of this country and maybe what things you can start doing to get ready for that. You can get it at any bookstores, Amazon.com, Borders. Great book. You want to get it by Professor Thomas Naylor, right? And his other book, Downsizing the USA. You want to get that too. You need this information so you can make some good decisions. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.